I think it's safe to say that everyone in here has had their fair share of presentations to listen to. And yes. And while some of them might have been marvelous, others might have been a little bit more difficult to follow or to stay engaged with. This is true for inexperienced presenters like myself, but also for speakers who have been in the business for decennia. Yeah, one easy way to make a presentation a little bit more engaging, a little bit more interesting, is by the use of visual aid. Hence, this presentation will be about the use of visual aid, especially in videos from C-SPAN of congressional hearings. But before I start, let me first introduce myself. As mentioned a couple times before, I'm Rowan Peijs, and I am a junior in biochemistry with a minor in Spanish and psychology. I'm originally from Eindhoven, the Netherlands, and I am planning to get into medical school right after my undergraduate here at Purdue. As you might have heard, none of this is communication related. I do not have a base in communications, nor in political science, nor in speech or English. Yet something that I do have a lot of experience with is data visualization. Hence, I'm very well used to using visual aid in presentations. That's how I got to this topic. Going into the topic, I will first explain what visual aid is, how it should be used most effectively, and after that, I'll have two examples from the C-SPAN archives, one which is a good example on how to use visual aids, and one that could have been improved. So let's first get into what visual aid is. Visual aid, by definition, is an illustrative matter to supplement written, or in our case, spoken information. This can be done in many different ways. There's 6 examples here: graphs, tables, photos, videos, maps, audio, diagrams, but these are just some really simple things that I thought of in about 2 minutes. There's thousands of ways to represent data in a way that is supplementary to a presentation. One of my own favorite ways to represent information is by the use of infographics. When using visual aids, I like to say that there's 3 things that anyone has to think about. Number 1, visual aid should be visually appealing. It's one way to make people more engaged with the presentation and more interested about what's to come. Plus, who doesn't like to watch something pretty? Number 2 is it should obviously be informative. If you have visual aid that does not supplement your presentation, it should not be there because it will only be a distraction to your presentation. And number 3 is if you use visual aid in a presentation, it should be elaborated on. If you do not elaborate on your visual aids, it's difficult to understand for your viewers exactly how it is used, why it is used, or what the final point is that you should be taking away from it. Infographics, if you ask me, are the best way to do this, even without verbal elaboration on the topic. For example, the 3 examples that are up here. How vaccines work. It's a really clear, visually appealing. It has a lot of information, step by step. And other than that, it is also it has also been clearly structured. You've got another one about pet statistics in the USA. While it is a little bit less visually appealing, if you ask me, because it's a little bit more cluttered, there is a lot of information on there. It's very informative. And there's a lot of facts on here that can cause further elaboration, further research. But it could also be a lot easier than that. Like, for example, the last example that is on here, which is about wildlife in Australia. While there is not necessarily like an incredible amount of information on this infographic, it is definitely a way that, a visually appealing way to spark interest in a topic that you might otherwise not have even known about. Infographics are so versatile, it's even possible to make an infographic about infographics. If you would ever want to use it, this infographic shows both what fonts are normally used, what colors are used, sizes, information, what it is about, which countries are featured, the themes, etc., and that also shows how versatile infographics truly are. I love them. But not getting too deeply into infographics, that is not my topic of this presentation. My topic is how visual aid might be used in congressional hearings. For example, the ones that are in the C-SPAN archives. What is important in this is that during these videos, I will show two videos, one of a good example, one of a bad example. Do not think too deeply about the political message that is conveyed. That is not what we're talking about right now. That is something for another time. What you should be thinking about is how these visual aids are used, how they look like, but also how they are elaborated upon. And I'll also give an evaluation afterwards. My first example is a presentation by Senator John Cornyn in debate on a voting rights bill. He will be presenting, and what you will see is eventually he puts his visual aid on the pedestal and then elaborates upon it.
If these state voting laws then are not designed to restrict access to the ballot, you might wonder whether there was a pre-existing problem. So let's have a look. Did voters actually have a problem casting their ballot during the last election? Well, following the 2020 election, the Pew Research Center conducted a poll of the voting experience, and it found that the vast majority of voters, 94%, said that voting was easy. I don't think you could get 94% of the people to agree that the earth is round anymore. But here we have 94% of the voters who voted with ease.
As you can see, Mr. Cornyn puts on the pedestal and elaborates upon it. So let's go through the three main points that I brought up earlier. Visual appeal, information presenting, and elaboration upon the topic. For first, is this visual aid visually appealing? I would say so. It is blue letters on a red text with different sizes, one similar font, and it is very clear what the visual aid is trying to demonstrate. Is it informative? Most definitely. Because I think that everyone knows that 94% of the voters in 2020 thought that voting was easy. And number three, most importantly, is it elaborated upon? I do not know if any of you have counted. I did. Mr. Cornyn mentions the number 94% 4 times. 94%, 94%. Gives an example on how much 94% truly is. Do 94% of the people agree that the earth is round? Probably not. And then yet again mentions 94%. It is important to consider how Mr. Cornyn used this visual aids to his own purpose, and also made sure to elaborate deeply upon what that 94% means. And I think his point is pretty clear. Going forward, you have a representative of the House, Dan Newhouse, who is having a presentation on the death of Indigenous women, and more specifically, the death of Rosinda Strong. What you will see is that this visual aid is less so elaborated upon. Plus, I will also have some information about it later on, but let's first watch the video.
After 300 days of searching, the body of Rosinda Strong was finally found on the Yakima Nation Reservation in central Washington. The life of this young mother of 4 was not lost, but taken, as are the lives of many other Native American women across the nation. Rosinda is a citizen of the Confederated Tribes of the Umatilla, and her case is one of 71 unsolved cases involving missing and murdered Indigenous women in Washington state. Since she went missing last October, her loved ones have rallied to bring national attention to the alarming high number of murder and violence rate facing Native American women across the country. Children are left without mothers. Parents are left without daughters, and communities are left questioning their safety and their future. This crisis can no longer be ignored. Congress must act to deliver justice to victims like Rosenda and so many others like her. Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I yield back.
While what happened to these Indigenous women, and especially also Rosenda Strong, obviously, is tragic, most definitely, it is important to look at how Mr. Newhouse uses his visual aid. To start off with, visual appeal. While it is clear that what is portrayed in the visual aid is a demonstration, it's somewhat of a messy picture. Number two, is it informative? Not necessarily. This demonstration could have been from anything, unless if you more deeply look into what is said on the poster boards. It doesn't even have to be within the country of the USA. It could have been any a protest about any topic in the history of photography. But more importantly, does Mr. Newhouse elaborate upon his visual aid? No. At the start of his presentation, the visual aid was already up on the pedestal, meaning it could have just as well been a background that had nothing to do with the presentation itself. Added to that, because it is in the background at all times, it almost looks as something that you can just look at if you got bored of the presentation, which is obviously not something you would want. What would be potentially better to do with such a poster is have pictures of family members. Mr. Newhouse goes into all the children who do not have a mother anymore, all of the parents who do not have a daughter anymore. Show the faces of either the victims or their families. Another possibility, show a map of all the people that of all the areas that have been affected. You could have a quote on there directly from any of the directly affected people. There's many ways to have a more strongly emotional effect than having just a random picture of a random protest in the background. So going back to what I said before, and I know I've repeated this 3 times now, but I'll do it another 4th. When you have a visual aid and you use it to back up any of your information, think of these 3 points. Is your visual aid visually appealing? Is it nice to look at? Will people actually want to look at it for further elaboration on the topic? Is it informative, or does it not truly represent the information that you are trying to present? And most importantly, is it elaborated upon? Does it truly enhance the presentation you're trying to give? If not, do not have it. If it is, good work, you've given a good presentation. I want to thank you for your time, for listening to me, and have a great rest of your conference.
Oh no, we're not done with you yet. Okay, so we encourage our students to participate the same way that you do. So if you have any questions for Rowan, now would be a great time to ask him, or has this inspired any of you with some of your research? So does anybody have any questions we can start off with?
Yeah, so first, this is the topic that I've thought about, just because these visual aids are something that's kind of unique that happens on these videos. So why do you think that they're using the visual aids? Like, you know, not every member of Congress does it, so I'm curious what you think of why one member of Congress would choose to use one while another would not.
As mentioned in the start of my presentation, sometimes a presentation or a topic is a little bit more difficult to comprehend. For example, there are topics in which there are lots of statistics. There's topics with a few contradictions, or where it's difficult to get the full grasp of the topic. In topics like these, where it might be more difficult to truly comprehend what is being said, it is smart to use visual aid. Not only does this provide a way to elaborate upon yet again, but it is also a background in which if people are confused or if people want to know more about the topic, they have the possibility to quickly look back, hey, what is it about again? What are the statistics? And what does this truly mean? It's better to use no visual aid than a bad visual aid if you ask me. So if there is no need for one, do not use one because it can be distracting. It can be a reason for people to stop listening to what you're saying exactly. But if for example, I'll quickly go back. if any of these visual aids are available and truly truly adds to your presentation in such a way that listeners will feel like they have more comprehension on the topic, then they should use it. I hope that answers the question.
Yes, absolutely. Thanks.
Thank you.
I just wondered if you've seen Representative Katie Porter. She often uses a whiteboard.
Mm-hmm.
So I just wondered, that's obviously less polished than your ideas of visual aids. I just wondered if you've seen them and if that sort of complicates your idea and best practices of visual aids.
Let me quickly pull these on. I have not seen the person that you are talking about, but thinking about the idea of having a whiteboard, and I assume that she actively writes on the whiteboard or draws on it while speaking. While this does fulfill number 2 and number 3, so it's informative, it shows statistics, it probably shows a better view of what's happening, and it is most definitely elaborated upon, and you know that it's brought to attention right as the topic is brought up. Depending on how skilled she is in that practice, it might be less visually appealing, and especially if you do not prepare what you're about to write down, and if you're just scribbling along, it might be conceived as less structured, and it might even be more difficult to understand the statistics or the broader view because of the way how it is set down. If someone has prepared the presentation in such a way that they know what they're going to write down at what point in what way, then I think that's maybe even a better way to use visual aids than a presentation or just like a poster board. But as said, for that they will have to be so well prepared that it is also visually appealing, or at least is not visually appealing, for clarity's sake.
All right, Rowan, thank you so much. Thank you for the great questions.
Thank you.
Hi. Hello, my name is Abigail Soliven, and I'm a junior here at Purdue. I'm majoring in chemistry and minoring in English. It's a pretty interesting combination, I know. And then why am I here presenting through the School of Communication? Well, there's a big commonality between both of my fields of study, so chemistry and English, science and art, and that is communication. So I have this quote up here for you from Anne Rowe, a noted American psychologist and writer. She said that nothing in science has any value to society if it is not communicated. And that makes sense, right? If there's a world-changing invention or discovery out there, but nobody knows about it, either from lack of communication or from poor communication, how will it actually make an impact? So what I like to do today is focus on science communication and investigate how scientific experts can use storytelling, which is like the English side of me, as an effective method of communication for their work. So I've told you a little bit about my story, and now let's dive into another one, COVID, right? That's a pretty familiar story. We all have our own experiences with it. These headlines could just keep going and going even up to today. I know what I was doing when in-person classes were postponed, then canceled. And then this was when in-person became a valid question, when before it was an assumption. With this influx of new questions and uncertainties, the matter came up of who should we listen to about this disease and how to stay safe? And then when eyes turned to the scientists and those experts in disease and health policy, they were put on the spot. As these stories were unfolding, what were they going to tell? So I'm going to go ahead and dive into a quick clip, and then we can discuss what went well with their communication style and their storytelling and what didn't. So in this video, Dr. Robert Redfield, who is the previous director of the CDC, is speaking to Congress about the response to COVID-19 so far in some of the developing cases. And so this was also in February 2nd of 2020, so relatively early and before COVID was officially declared a pandemic.
Guidance provided them by CDC. On February 26, CDC confirmed an infection with the virus caused by COVID-19 in a person who reportedly did not have any relevant travel history or exposure to other COVID patients. It's possible this could be an instance of community spread of COVID, which would be the first time this has happened in the United States. 3 cases have been detected among the Americans repatriated from Wuhan, and another 43.
That was kind of boring. Essentially monotone, just reading off information, and he'll pause for emphasis. Sure, he's speaking to Congress, and there's a lot of information to summarize in a short amount of time, but he's also still telling a story, and there's absolutely zero engagement. This is important information. First case of community spread in the US. How am I supposed to know this if he doesn't give some sort of cue? He just continues on to the next set of numbers as if it doesn't directly affect people's lives. This is the important part of storytelling. It's personal. People listening want that story to mean something to them. So experts should make that connection if they want people to remember their work. Here's the science, here is the data, and here is what it means for you. Let's go ahead and look at another clip. So in this video from March 3rd, 2020, which is a week before COVID was officially declared a pandemic, Dr. Stephen Redd, who is the Deputy Director for Public Health Service and a senior official in the CDC's coronavirus response team, speaks to the Senate about recent updates in the spread of the virus.
While the immediate risk to the general American public is low today, the U.S. government is doing everything we can to keep it low. Risk varies by exposure, and some areas of the country are now experiencing community spread. I ask you as trusted leaders in your communities to help us with our mission to provide clear information to you and your constituents by urging people to get the facts from CDC about how to best protect themselves and their families. Thank you.
Better, right? We have acknowledgement of the public and more focus on what all he's talked about, which is updates on the spread, means for the average person. And again, this is an integral aspect of storytelling, engaging and connecting the audience to your material. Think about how stories are often used as lessons. So like in fables or in history, the same can and should be true for science. There's a misconception that a lot of scientific concepts are out of reach for the public because they're so technical. But if scientific experts take steps to communicate via story and emphasize what their data or findings mean personally to people, so make that knowledge more tangible, then we'll see improved communication of science as well as retention of those ideas and concepts. So let's look at one more clip. In this video from November 19th, 2020, so we're well into the pandemic, Dr. Peter McCullough, who's Vice Chair of Internal Medicine at Baylor and a Professor of Medicine at Texas A&M, speaks to the Senate.
We have the greatest mass of infected Americans that we've ever had since the start of the pandemic, and Americans are pouring into hospitals untreated. The hospital census is already at capacity. A national calamity of unimaginable mortality is right around the corner. In a matter of weeks to months, Americans are going to be horrified with what they see on the news with respect to a hospital overrun, mortality skyrocketing for both COVID and non-COVID complications and conditions, and patients further infecting other Americans as this pandemic spirals out of control. My viewpoint.
We have a storyteller. So he was talking about early outpatient treatment, and I genuinely wanted to know a little bit more about what he was presenting, which is a stark difference to the previous two speakers. By setting the scene and focusing on what the average American would see in the media or in their daily life, he's able to draw Senate into the story and the visual that he's creating. After this clip, he talks about early outpatient treatment and what doctors can do with Senate support in order to reduce the amount of people who are hospitalized due to COVID or associated ailments. I personally remember those news stories that he referenced, the ones about hospitals being overrun with patients, the stories about nurses and doctors working themselves to the bone to care for all of these people. I know that some of you do remember these too. So these are the stories that stick in your mind. And what Dr. McCullough did was connect these stories to the science. And now the science means more to people. It's effective communication. So I'll close and leave you all with a final quote from Robert McKee, who's an American author and lecturer. Storytelling is the most powerful way to put ideas into the world today. Thank you. I'd be more than happy to answer questions.
Yes, thank you for the presentation. So what I loved about this is that, so I do a lot of work with audio data. And so the way that you're describing like engagement storytelling, in my work I describe it as emotional intensity. And honestly, it's really just the difference between a speaker giving a speech in which they seem to be invested in what they're actually articulating versus a speaker, as you began earlier on, who speaks in monotone, who seems like they're just going through the impressions. Mm-hmm. And what's remarkable is that that's highly correlated with nonverbal cues, because if they're more animated, that is reflected in the audio and the video of the stream. So, so how much do you think kind of presentation is important for storytelling versus like the content of the story? Do you think somebody could deliver a story that is about something that's, you know, maybe personal, but do so in like a monotonic fashion and still have the same effect? Or do you think it's more about just delivering information in a way that people can understand that you actually think that information is important, that they need to pay attention? So I'm curious how you weigh on that.
Yeah, I think one important aspect is definitely the audience who you're speaking to. And so if I'm presenting my chemistry work to a group of experts also in chemistry, then I can probably be a little bit off on the presentation side of it, because they're going to get it and they're going to be engaged in it because they all love chemistry too and they want to know more about my work. But if I were presenting to, say, a bunch of students or my parents who don't necessarily know much about chemistry, I'm definitely going to have to put a little bit more into the presentation and the performance aspect of it. Think about like listening to your middle school science teacher or watching a Bill Nye video. You might want to be a little bit more excited listening to Bill Nye, right? Especially for all of you who might not be more interested in science. So you're going to be more engaged with something that's a little bit more of a performance because it's not a subject matter you're necessarily specifically interested in. And so I think the same would be true for presentations.
I just wanted to say thank you for saying that, because during our research that we were doing, I had a similar, basically idea around that. I was listening to all these different speakers speak at Congress, and only a select few, when it's like they really wanted to get their point across, were doing what you were saying and having that expressive statements to make people remember what they were saying. And I just want to say I appreciate this work a lot, because it finally gave my brain the rest that it needed as to why it was thinking that something was wrong there. So thank you.
Thank you for saying that.
Comment more than a question, but
Sure.
Your ideas comport with what we understand from, I study strategic communication, persuasive communication. Mm-hmm. And the language that we use to describe these concepts that you described in your presentation is narrative evidence versus statistical evidence. Mm-hmm. And generally, statistical evidence is boring, as you say, and less persuasive. In the context you bring up, you're talking about behavior change, persuasive context. Storytelling, especially that is engaging, and the language that we use as communication scholars is allows people to transport themselves into the story, mm-hmm. seems to be more meaningful in bringing about meaningful behavior change. But the general finding is that when you combine those two things, you tell stories on top of statistical evidence. Those are the most meaningful and persuasive messages. So it's interesting for me as a person who studies these things, and interesting for you, if you just landed on these concepts because you're a smart person. It's in line with with the research on how these types of messages bring about behavioral effects. So thank you.
Thank you. Maybe if we combine Rowan and I's presentation with the statistics and the storytelling, yeah.
I'll plug my subfield too. As a rhetorician, I love that you are effectively saying that delivery matters, and that's actually true. But as a question, I think there's certainly a you've identified the monotonic, which I have not used that word ever before. I love it. Thank you. And then there's probably a happy medium of good storytelling with a combination of statistics, but we've also seen, especially in recent years, the kind of hyperbolic, over-exaggerated storytelling that tends to turn people off of and have, I think, probably a diminished return on in terms of impact. So Where did you see anything in your review of videos where, okay, here's the end point where it's now getting too dramatic and people are turning off their attention?
Mm-hmm. Actually, in the final clip before, because he was a witness, Dr. McCullough was a witness, and the opening statement by like the senator beforehand, I felt was a little bit much. He was getting very into a story, a personal story about like his daughter who was hospitalized for certain things and trying to connect it to doctors and like you should be trying to help people. And I think in some cases a story can be effective, but then you have to consider, is the story for other people or is it kind of for me as the presenter? Because sometimes I think you might all be familiar with this. We get in our own heads about our own findings and data, and it's something that makes sense to us, but it might not make sense to others. So I think while certain stories like that, Senator's discussion about his daughter made total sense in his mind. He was like, yeah, this is why this is necessary. To me, as a viewer of the clip, and honestly probably to the witnesses, they're like, okay, where are we getting with this point here? So I think that's something an important consideration to make. When is it a good time to share a story? Will it make sense for other people as well?
All right, thank you,
so
Abby.
much.
Okay.
Okay, my name's Sydney Piercey. I graduated in May from Purdue with a degree in political science and minors in communication and psychology. And I'm going to talk about agenda setting and the 2016 presidential election. So what is agenda setting? Agenda setting is a communication theory that basically says the media influences public's perceptions of certain issues. So if the media covers issue X, the public is going to consider issue X important. And it's also important to note that the media doesn't tell us how to feel about these issues, it just tells us what issues to think about. So it's not influencing our opinions on the issues, it's just pushing issues to the forefront of our minds and telling us to think about and consider these issues. So the 2016 presidential election is a good example of this, and we can actually kind of follow this theory from the primary to the general election. And we're going to focus on the Republican side, specifically on Donald Trump. So the Republican Party had 17 candidates at the first RNC sanctioned debate. That was a lot. And people actually followed that. That garnered a lot of media coverage. People were really interested in the Republican primary in 2015-16. So the first RNC debate was split up into 2 nights because of the size of the candidate pool. And night 2 had the favored candidates. And that event had the largest to-date broadcast audience for a non-sport cable event as of 2015. So people were watching that. The media was covering that. They were airing it. They were doing analysis of it. And they focused a lot on Donald Trump. And they focused on him, what I would say is prematurely. So at the beginning of the primary, he received an unprecedented amount of free media, and his media coverage was not proportional to his polling numbers. He wasn't polling very well, but the media was covering him because he was interesting, he was novel, and he made really good news. If you loved Donald Trump, you wanted to watch him. If you hated him, you also wanted to watch him. So he received 34% of the news coverage given to the top GOP candidates, and that's almost double what the next candidate received. So Bush received 18, and then everybody else received way, way less. You can also see this in the C-SPAN archives themselves. When I was doing research for this, there are 170 videos in the archives on the Trump 2016 campaign, 38 on the Cruz campaign, and 34 on the Kasich campaign, and that's all within the same time period. So that's just in the primary elections. So he got so much coverage that the media started talking about how much the media was covering Trump, so it gets kind of meta. The media was like, he's getting so much coverage, and then they're like still covering him. So this is a reporter discussing the media coverage of the entire election and of Donald Trump specifically.
Rubio, people are trying to wrap their arms around how do you cover Donald Trump. Now, a lot about Donald Trump has been written in the past. I mean, he's been the subject of books, of documentaries. People are starting to plumb a little bit further into his background. But look, I mean, you are seeing some of the most robust coverage of this presidential race, of any presidential race, in decades, perhaps.
Litchfield, New York.
All right, so we've established that he was covered extensively by the media, which begs the question of, will this media coverage translate to a perception of issue importance among the public? Do people consider Donald Trump important, and did they during this election? My next video is going to answer that question. This is from an open phone segment on C-SPAN, which is where people call in and talk about like the political issue of the day.
60 voter things? Okay, so I'm not getting this quite clear.
Well, Marissa, step back and talk about how the media has covered these issues and these issues that are important to you and to your candidate.
Okay, because it's all about Trump. It's Trump this, Trump that, Trump here, Trump there, everything about Trump. You barely hear about Bernie Sanders. He's got this huge, gigantic momentum.
So this is a Bernie Sanders supporter calling C-SPAN to talk about Trump, which was kind of funny. So clearly it's working. The media is covering Trump, and everybody considers Donald Trump an important issue, something to talk about. So she's a Democratic voter, probably a Bernie Sanders supporter, and she's talking about how important Trump is in this election. So the media presented Trump as an important issue. People are perceiving Trump as an important issue, and this is agenda setting. So just to summarize, media coverage of Trump preceded his polling numbers, and it led to the emergence of Trump as a big player in the Republican primary and ultimately in the general election, which he won. So the media kind of set this agenda of we're going to talk about Donald Trump, and people followed, and they said we're going to talk about Donald Trump. And that is how agenda setting works. And more than that, agenda setting is important because it shows the power the media has to kind of influence what we as the public think about. Like if the media is not covering it, we might not know about it, we might not think about it. If they are covering it, we're going to know about it, and we're going to think about it. And we can also take from this the really like intertwined relationship between media and politics. Like the media affected this election. And so that's always something to keep in mind when talking about politics and the media. Thank you.
Okay, do we have any questions? Because that was a really hot topic.
So you were referencing how basically, as we all know, you all know based on the presentation, that the media just became a fire sphere that was just Donald Trump all the time, always, forever, during the 2016 primary election. Now, would you say based on your research that that level of coverage and that level of communicative data just around a singular candidate, more than likely, because you stated that he had lower polling numbers towards the beginning, do you think that continuous flow of free publicity may or may not have, based on your research, I don't know if you can answer this question, like probably have pushed him to the front, whereas if he wasn't covered as heavily, it would have been a more like equal race?
I mean, yeah. I mean, people pay for advertisement, and he was getting it for free. I mean, he was all over the TV. And I mean, I'm guessing there are statistics to support that, just like how much people, visibility is huge in politics. Like if you want to get elected, you have to be seen. And he was getting seen by everybody quite a bit. So I would assume yes.
Thank you.
Well, then I'll ask. So when you were looking through there, what did you find that surprised you the absolute most in the videos themselves?
Like the C-SPAN videos? Mm-hmm. I think what was interesting to me is that people talked about Trump a lot, and it wasn't usually his policies. It was his character. And so I think like the media talked about his character too, like all these reporters. It's like, oh, him as a person versus him as a politician, which I think was interesting because that's in contrast to the other people who were in the primary, who it was like, oh, they voted this way in the past in their political careers. They think this is their platform. And he was just kind of exempt from that like scrutiny of his policy because everyone was so focused on his character.
And do you think that made a difference in the nomination?
I think so. I think people are always done with career politicians, and so I think he kind of got a slide by a little bit.
Well, thank you so much. All right, big round of applause.